French myself out the little ecosystem that Treasury has built. I enjoy it.
You are going first. Is that all right? You'll be okay. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event, an event we've been looking forward to for some time. We decided a while ago to have this event a week after the referendum because we had a little nagging suspicion that possibly the quality of economic discourse in the referendum wouldn't be as high as we wanted. That was a kind of safe bet, I think. Now, could you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent, but don't turn it off because we're very keen. There's already a very lively debate taking place online around this. So the hashtag is hashtag Citizens Economy if you want to tweet. Also, we're filming tonight's event and we're streaming live over the web. So welcome to, I think, many hundreds, thousands of people possibly who are joining us online. I hope you'll get involved also in the conversation on Twitter. Now, a year ago, roughly speaking, I stood in this room and gave my annual lecture, which was around a kind of more substantive debate about the economy and economic goals. And one of the points that I made in that speech was I said that I'm a sociologist, but no one has ever said to me that they can't have a view about society because they're not a sociologist. But often people say that they can't really have a view about the economy because they're not economists. And one of the things that I suggested in that speech was that we might establish some kind of way of showing that ordinary citizens, thoughtful citizens, can get their heads around economic concepts, can challenge what they hear from people, and can explore economic ideas. Now, normally, when I give my annual lecture, my colleagues at the RSA very wisely ignore almost everything I say, but this particular idea was taken seriously. And so for the last year, we've been working on the idea of the Citizens Economic Council, which is what we're launching tonight. It's a new program that will support citizens to be more informed, empowered and directly engaged with policymakers and politicians on key economic policy areas and issues. And tonight we've gathered a panel of policymakers, expert commentators, activists to help us think through how we can have a better, more democratic national debate, which, as I say, the results of the recent referendum have shown is possibly more urgently required than ever before. So we're delighted to welcome Seema Malhotra, who's MP for Feltham and Heston, and former Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. You're in good company in the former bit, I guess, in that regard. But we're really pleased that you've come.
Yeah, there've been many former Shadow Chief Secretaries.
Oh, that's true, yes, okay. But we're delighted that you've joined us tonight. You didn't have to come because you haven't got that job anymore, but you've turned up and we're really, really pleased about that. So thank you for that, Seema. Simon Burall, who's Director of Involve, a think tank and charity specialising in public participation. Julie Timbrell, an activist, community artist, democracy practitioner who's been involved with the Occupy democracy movement from its earliest days, and is currently working with other occupiers on a citizen-led constitutional convention. So someone at the kind of activist end of this, right through to a pillar of the establishment, if you don't mind me saying that, Paul. Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's leading independent microeconomic research institute. So we couldn't have a better range of speakers on this topic. But before we bring in our panel, and just to set the scene and fill in a bit more detail on the aims of the Council, I'm going to introduce you to two people. Tony Greenham, who's Director of the RSA's Economy, Enterprise and Manufacturing Programme, the part of the RSA that's going to be overseeing this project, and Reema Patel, who's Programme Manager for the Citizens Economic Council. So here they are. Tony.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So I'm just going to pull some key points out of the prospectus that we've published today that you've got a copy on your seats. Doesn't mean you still don't have to read it, you do. But briefly, I'm going to cover why do we think we need a Citizens Economic Council? What's the context? Well, 3 points I'd pick out. Firstly, the erosion of public trust in our institutions and in experts now. And we first perceived this after the financial crisis, but I think you'd all agree that that has now got worse during the course of the referendum debate. And why that particularly matters now is that really, in terms of economic policy, but a whole range of policies, the 21st century is presenting us with a range of complex challenges. which we need to rise to meet. So whether it's potentially devastating environmental degradation, huge demographic shifts, migration around the world, or just the disruptive social impacts of technology. So more than ever, we need to have good quality policy making. But we perceive that the narrowness of economic debate is holding us back. We perceived this during the 2015 general election, and we perceive it now. And in fact, what the referendum seems to have done is it's a mechanism for driving people apart. And what we're trying to design here is a mechanism for bringing people together to discuss what the goals of our economy are and how we could achieve them. And so there are 4 particular challenges we want to address. The first is to improve economic literacy. So our survey evidence shows that even though GDP is the prime yardstick of the success of economic policy, fewer than 4 out of 10 of us even know what it means. And I don't know whether improved economic literacy would have meant that the statistic, so-called, of £350 million a week being sent to Brussels would have been seen through. But what I'm quite certain is that that statistic would not survive a deliberative, participatory process. It would be seen as misleading. Secondly, we need to increase the transparency that lies behind the economic forecast that we're given. So here I might pick out something from the Remain side. We will be £4,300 a year worse off if we leave the EU. Of course, that statistic really is meaningless unless you understand the assumptions that lie behind it. For example, that's by 2030, that it assumes that we take on the same relationship as Canada now does with the EU. Who knows whether that will be our relationship? Nobody knows. And even whether it makes sense to present that forecast loss of GDP per household, whether that bears any relation to the actual economic impacts that people would feel in their everyday lives is quite doubtful. So we need to improve the transparency that lies behind the economic debate that we have. Thirdly, as a result of these first 2, it suggests there's a democratic deficit. It's difficult to hold politicians to account on economic policy. And so that's really the subject of our debate tonight. And the first poll, we were sort of getting at this question. So perhaps now we can see the results of the first poll. So interestingly, more than half of you, so that's a clear majority, believe that any citizen can have a say about economic goals and how they are achieved, but they need to be informed. So perhaps the panel can also give us their sort of views of those results later on. And finally, this is probably another challenge is that we need to have more space for creativity and innovation in policy. So that's the other thing we want to try and achieve. Uncertainty is a word we've all got used to. Uncertainty is a reality, actually, in economic forecasting. So we need to have more voices getting into the debate on economic policy, I think, to address that. And so final word before I hand over to Seema, about the values, the way the RSA wants to conduct this project. Firstly, we approach this in a very collaborative way. This isn't just a project, this needs to be, the idea of democratizing economics has to be a movement, it has to be a collective effort. Secondly, we are very keen to be open and transparent and neutral, and so we are delighted and honored that we have a panel of 10 distinguished experts who've joined an independent advisory panel to advise us on how to conduct this. Their biographies are all in the prospectus, so please do have a look. And finally, I think we want to be pioneering with this. We think we're doing something new with the Citizens Economic Council, and I think that it's fair to say that there's a gaping void now in politics between the doorstep and the dispatch box, and this is our attempt to start to fill that void. So I'll hand over now to Seema to tell you how it's going to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. So I think the really interesting starting point is your response to that poll. More than half of you felt that citizens needed to be more informed as part of having a say about economic policy, and that is precisely the value of these kinds of processes. So, I mean, one example might well be the Constitutional Convention in Ireland. We feature that in our prospectus, Economics for Everyone. I recommend you have a read. But in that example, Ireland brought together 66 randomly stratified and selected citizens to deliberate and to spend some time talking about a host of constitutional issues. These included lowering the voting age to 17, they also included introducing same-sex marriage and whether a referendum should be held on that issue, and they included the introduction of economic and social rights as part of Ireland's constitutional reform and agenda. Now, I'd like to pick up in particular on their recommendation for same-sex marriage and a referendum to be held. That, many of you will recall, was subsequently held, and 62% voted in favour of implementing same-sex marriage. So, given what's recently happened with the EU referendum, it's worthwhile thinking about the value and the contribution that deliberative processes can make, and in this instance, have made. Deliberative processes, what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is a group of individuals who are brought together, who have the opportunity to talk directly with policymakers, with stakeholders and with economists, and to understand and to engage with each other, their different values, their different perspectives and their different opinions, and also to have an open and transparent and mutually respectful conversation about the complex and controversial issues that they are engaging with. So that's what we mean by that, and the Ireland Constitutional Convention process enabled that to happen. And really that's a starting point for what inspired us to begin on this journey with the Citizens Economic Council. The Citizens Economic Council will bring together 50 to 60 citizens to engage in a similar process about the complex issues that face our country from across the UK. As well as doing that, we're engaging with a wide range of stakeholders, so organising groups, self-organising groups that are already talking about these issues, will be able to put forward policy ideas to the Citizens Economic Council. As well as that, we will be hosting an economic inclusion roadshow, specifically reaching out to hard-to-reach groups and communities to support them to put forward policy ideas for consideration in the Citizens Economic Council. And anyone will be able to take part in online crowdsourcing that will, again, form part of the ideas that the Citizens Economic Council consider. The citizens, of course, will be encouraged and supported to come up with their own policy ideas. And I think really the key points to bear in mind is that there is an opportunity for all of us to get involved to shape the direction and future of this programme. I very much encourage you to all do that. I really want to leave with the words of somebody else, Margaret Mead, who's an anthropologist. She said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that has. Thank you very much, and I hope you agree with that.
Thank you, Reema, and please do take very seriously Reema's final point, which is that we hope this is the beginning of your participation. It's a 2-year programme, so there'll be lots and lots and lots of opportunities for you to get involved, with your organisation to get involved. So let's go back to let's bring in our panel of speakers who we asked them the question, and the question was, can citizens really be economists, and what might be the extent of their role and influence in shaping economic policy? And also, panel, you've seen the response to the brief poll we did with people when they came in, which indicates a majority who believe that ordinary citizens can have expert views on have strong views, valid views on economics, but that they need to be properly informed. So, commenting on the question and on the poll results, Seema, over to you first.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And I want to just congratulate as well the RSA on this initiative and to share a few thoughts from the perspective of somebody who has had as my day job, and in many ways that's still the case, challenging the government's economic policy and trying to win back trust from the British people that we may have an alternative and valid point of view. What's been striking to me is the difficulty of engaging in a debate where you're talking about the economy and you're talking about the impact of choices that have been made, and trying to get beyond the, in a sense, the simplicity of some of the political language and slogans. What it has said to me is that if we're to engage in a really productive way with with the British people about the future of our economy, about where we're going, about our economic goals, then there is absolutely a deficit of, in terms of knowledge and people's, in a sense, confidence to engage in that conversation that needs to be challenged and addressed. It's one of the reasons why I am really pleased that John McDonnell, for whom I have a lot of respect for how he's tried to set an alternative to our economic strategy in the Labour Party, has developed the outreach and the lecture series to go out and to have conversations about economics and, in a sense, demystify economics. I think if we break down some of what economics really does mean and can mean to people in terms of their lives and how decisions are made, whether that's about how we want to and how we develop economic growth, what role there is for the state in that, what we might choose, how we might choose to invest, how much we might choose to invest, what the impact's going to be on the government's balance sheets and whether that matters or it doesn't. Those are vital conversations, because if you don't have a way in which you're building confidence in those decisions, then in a sense you are subject to who people choose to believe because of the language being used and the cleverness of communications and politics of the time. What the poll shows and suggests to me is almost a hypothesis that we have, which is that with a little bit more information, and it doesn't always have to be that much, you can shift a conversation from being very superficial to one being much more advanced. And I believe that that is vital for us holding politicians to account more effectively, as well as making far better decisions as a nation. I'll give you one illustration of that. This is not being party political, obviously, but when George Osborne took over the reins and when we left government, the economy was growing, productivity was increasing. And just as one measure, there's been a stall in productivity since then. We believe that that has had whilst it's not a exact science, there's been a lot to do with choices made about investment, cuts in the wrong places, that have had an adverse impact on our economic growth. Now, getting beyond into a level of sophistication about that, to be able to win an argument that the government's economic strategy has actually not succeeded, despite the language that it and the belief that it has, when we're in a sense on the back foot as the Labour Party, is really difficult. But when you start to break it down and you start to take it down into a kind of more plain English about, well, look, we've cut skills, or we didn't have this investment, or these projects haven't started, or look, broadband isn't reaching and that's holding back entrepreneurs, or it's holding back connectivity, and that's actually then having an impact on local growth. You can get into different kinds of conversation, but people don't always understand those the more macro level conversations. If we're to bridge that gap between the conversations we might have in Westminster, the enormous the decisions being made about investment, the permission perhaps either to raise taxes or to borrow more to fund that, you need to have a conversation about what the outcomes are likely to be and what we want to achieve together, and how the achievement and growth of our nation's economy has a benefit to all of us. I think we've become quite lazy in the way that we reflect and talk about these decisions in in some ways, and it's also meant that when it comes to, say, analysis of the budget, it comes down to kind of very micro level sort of conversations. And what often happens in politics, as you know, is that people will want you to see what they want you to see, and they'll try and have you not notice something else going on behind the scenes. And the budget is a great time for those games to be played by a chancellor. So for us, when we've said we believe that the decisions being made are not in the long-term interests of the country and our economy, and they're not sustainable, getting beyond and winning the argument for that and is very difficult when people don't have a basis on which to be engaging with you. So if we go back to the basic question about can citizens be economists, well, I think everybody can be. The question is the scale and level of knowledge that you need in order to be engaging more effectively. I think that why it's important, I think it absolutely comes down to this need to be engaging with the public on big decisions that we're making in terms, why we're making those arguments for saying that we need to shift our economy in this way or that, or potentially how we make sure that we're sharing prosperity across the nation. One of the things that I believe was a driver for the outcome of the result in the referendum campaign was the lack of shared prosperity across the nation and people not feeling that they were receivers of the benefits of us being in the European Union. But I think another reason why we didn't win the argument on the economy, because in the sense it came down to economy versus immigration, was that the way in which we had those macro level conversations about, you know, the 227 billion exports, billions worth of exports, that 200,000 companies that exported, is people didn't connect that with their lives and the decisions and how therefore an exit would impact them in their own life and potentially for their children or their grandchildren's futures. So, in conclusion, I want to just talk briefly about how I think we can make a big difference. The first is having economic debate that is far more extensive. I think it has to start much more in schools, and I think it has to continue some way through the way we engage in society. I think there's something happens when we leave school, which is you don't have ways in which you can then continue to be involved in policy. And I notice this when people don't have confidence to be involved in these debates. But also, you would be surprised the number of members of Parliament who don't feel able to take part in debates as much on economic issues because they don't feel as equipped themselves to be able to argue what might be better or worse for their own constituencies. So I think it has to be a language and a level of understanding that has to be absolutely increased at scale if we're to get beyond what we've started to see, which is a Trump kind of politics, absolutely, that says if we discount the experts and we just go with what you might think or believe, that there isn't going to be any difference and there's going to be an outcome that is going to still be better for you. We have to have a better and more sophisticated way of engaging in politics, and good politics will lead to good economics.
Thank you, Seema. So, Simon Burall, Director of Involve, you've been, getting people involved in debates is kind of your life's work. So share your pain with us.
Nearly life's work. I'm going to make a facile point. I'm going to challenge the basis of your question. I'm going to dig myself into a hole about what the nature of expertise is, and I'm going to try and dig myself out of it in 5 minutes. Yeah. My facile point is, who here is an economist? How many of you are also citizens? Of course, economists can be citizens and citizens can be economists. And the question is whether they need to be. And I think that's the absolutely critical thing if we're going to engage in a debate about the future of the country, is what do citizens need to have to engage in that debate? And it's obviously patronising to think that citizens can't be economists. And my worry about the way the question is framed is that, well, one, it assumes that economics is the only expertise you need in order to make all sorts of public policy decisions of the kinds that we're talking about. We need science, we need transport policy, we need health, we need a whole range of things. And I don't think we're expecting citizens to be experts in all of those things. So if economics isn't the only expertise, what expertise do citizens need to engage? And I think that's a really critical question. Because if we assume that citizens don't understand a certain area of knowledge, what we tend to then do is assume that deficit means that if we can only get them to understand that GM crops are actually quite safe, or that following this economic policy will mean this will happen, then actually they'll just agree with us. But the problem is that actually there's no right answer in public policy. There's a series of, increasingly, after Thursday, bad choices. But there's no right choice. There's just a series of choices that affect different people in different ways. We can't all win. So the question is actually about, well, let me just pull back. So then I come to this question of expertise. My second challenge to the question is that it assumes that there are certain types of expertise that are acceptable in a debate and other kinds of expertise that aren't. And what it means is that the kinds of expertise that citizens have about their daily lives, about their environment, about what their needs are, the needs of their community, is somehow secondary to this elevated academic expertise. So if we assume that economics is needed, it downgrades expertise as opposed to saying, actually, economics is critical. I'm not trying to say that economic expertise isn't critical, but actually expertise in who's networked to who's going to be affected by decisions in different ways is also critically important as we make decisions. So, as I say, if there are no right choices and we elevate one form of evidence over another, what we end up doing is framing the conversation in the wrong way. And so, let me give one example. So GM crops. I started out my activist career, I guess, if I could ever be called an activist, campaigning against GM crops. And the basis on which I did it was on the risk basis. I don't trust that these crops don't bring a risk of antibiotic resistance. What I really wanted to campaign about was monopolisation by Monsanto, about the supply chain, about what it meant for small farmers, but that wasn't the debate I was allowed to have. And the debate about GM is a debate about economics, ownership, who wins, who loses. It's also about risk, it's also about science risk, about those things as well. If you frame it in one frame and don't allow those broader sets of principles to come in, you're actually having the conversation in the wrong way. And that is what happened in the Leave debate and the Remain debate, is exactly that. We framed it as a question about Europe, as opposed to being a question about the nature of and the future of Britain and Britain's role in the world and what we want. I'm not for leave, but leave is a choice, and leave leads to certain consequences. And if we know what those consequences are and we decide it's still okay as a populace, well, okay, I'll be really unhappy. But actually, if we've done it knowingly, well, okay. So, what do experts therefore provide in the public debate? They provide boundaries. So, it's not possible to create energy out of nothing. So that means that certain types of policies are just impossible. Economics provides other boundaries. But what they do is they narrow the range of policy choices, but they give you a sense of what the different trajectories are that you can follow. So expertise needs to be used to create those boundaries for the debate, within which then those public policy questions, where the values that citizens bring, the expertise that they bring about their own lives and the lives of their community, then become absolutely central to the choices that we're making. So experts produce those boundaries, but they don't magically produce the right answer. I think one of the problems is, and one of the reasons the public distrust experts, is because experts too often in the public debate move from their expertise into their own opinion without acknowledging when it is that they're wearing their expert hat and when they're wearing their citizen hat. And if experts were much clearer about, actually, I do know this is what the research says, and therefore me as mother, me as magistrate, or me as citizen thinks we should do this on the basis of that, then it's a different thing. But we see this moving between expertise and citizen, or expertise and opinion, too often. And therefore, anecdote gets elevated to the same level as expertise. And therefore, it leads you inexorably to Trump. So, the role of... I may not stand by that comment later on, but let's... So the role of the public in economic policy is helping to balance the trade-offs about different economic choices that face us, bringing different values and perspectives, and bringing real-world experiences to add nuance to those economic models. And therefore, the key question is actually, how do you frame the debate so that expertise has its right place and citizens have an opportunity to have a proper voice? And that's the really critical thing.
I think one of the methods we're going to use in the council is a kind of method of getting people who disagree to work with each other to identify exactly what it is they disagree about. That is to say, what is the domain which is not covered by objective agreement, but where there is a lot of room for greater subjective judgment. So that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Now, Julie Timbrell. So apart, I mean, for Occupy from the very beginning, there's been this sense of it being about learning and engagement. So how does this initiative fit with what you've been doing?
Well, at the very beginning of Occupy, one of the things I was involved in was setting up a library that had happened. We just crowdsourced everyone bringing along their own books, and we shared that. And then that developed to Tent City University. And we had a whole range of people come down and give really amazing talks about economics. We had, one of my favourite was someone called John Chang. I think you've actually had him here. It's really good, 23 things that you don't know about capitalism. But we had like a really diverse range of views in there as well. And that was really, really interesting. So everybody talking about ecology, a whole range of things. And it's common now on our Facebook post to say, where did you get your education? It was Tent City University. And it was a really powerful time of people coming together and learning different things and hearing a whole range of different perspectives, because the people who turned up could have been, there was bankers that turned out, there were people, school teachers, there was just a whole range of really diverse people there that was really, really interesting. So I totally believe that ordinary people can learn from can learn about economics, because that's my personal experience. But now we've recently, the project that I've been involved with is about the citizen-led constitutional convention, and that's partly inspired by Iceland, because when Iceland had this big social movement with the collapse of the economy, people took to the streets. There was a pots and pans revolution, and they demanded constitutional change, and they gathered people together, and they had they went for a whole process and looking at goals and things like that. So I'm really, really inspired by this work. I think one of the things, to me, why the citizen voice is valuable is basically because I think, because of inequality. I think we've just got huge inequality in this country, and I think the inequality that the economic inequality is related to political disenfranchisement. In the UK, we've got the most, in the developed world, I found this statistic, that we've actually got the lowest level of political engagement. That's people who vote, people get engaged in things in the whole of the developed world. And I think that's no coincidence, that actually there's really huge levels of inequality and there's really low levels of political engagement, and I think those two mirror each other. So I think to get a random sample means that you're just getting like a broad range of socio-economic experiences that you don't get in normal politics, which tend to, we can see the makeup of the parliament. It's, definitely the present cabinet is really, really focused towards people who've had a very privileged upbringing. It doesn't represent the ordinary people. So I think it's a really fantastic opportunity. I think that, just picking up your point as well about what citizens bring, I think I totally agree. They bring this different voice, and they ask a different question. And that question up there, I think, it's gone now, but I thought it was really good. What's the goals of an economy?
I'll come back to it later.
Oh, okay, that's great. Because I think that's so important, and implicitly in most dialogue, what we hear that the goal of the economy is growth. But actually, we're now consuming in between 1.6 planets and 2.5 planets. And there's been studies by Tim Jackson, who was previously in the Labour government, who did a very good study and looked at growth and the consumption of resources. And you can't decouple those two things. You can reduce them, but essentially, the more the economy grows, the more it's going to cause resource depletion. And I think we need to really think about a different way of considering what is the economy. Is it about well-being? What does prosperity mean? So I think those are all really, really important things.
Great. And you've set us up brilliantly for a question we'll be asking people in a few minutes. So thank you, Julie. That's great. Now, so last but not least, Paul Johnson, IFS. So, I mean, you were absolutely at the heart of this debate. You were used as a kind of weapon not you personally, but the material that was produced by IFS was used as a weapon in the debate. You wrote about it. And then right towards the end of the campaign, it wasn't simply a campaign about one set of expertise versus another, but expertise itself was called into question. When Michael Gove, I think, said, we're a bit sick, really, as a country. We're sick of experts like you. So he didn't refer to you, but he might have been thinking of you. I'm interested in your view about this question about expertise and citizen engagement, and the degree to which also actually your own work, I mean, you bring objectivity to the discussion. Do you think it's an important part of what you do to try to make it more accessible to people as well?
Well, thank you. I was going to say how pleased I was to have made it into the establishment, but now I'm not so pleased to be not wanted as an expert. I mean, the last, I mean, referring to your question directly, I mean, the last month has been probably about the most depressing of my sort of professional career, in the sense of the quality of the debate around the stuff that we work on, and indeed the extent to which it was misused and the extent to which we were abused for being experts, for laying out the facts objectively as we saw them. And I think that gets to in a way, gets to the heart of this question, which is how are citizens supposed to come to judgments about these things, all of the sorts of things that are important in economics, when it's very difficult to pick out those elements of the debate which are trustworthy and accurate, and those that are forecasts and those that are lies. And, you know, that's the difference between the 4,300 number and the 350 million number. The 350 million number was a straightforward lie. And, you know, I think it's shocking that the BBC, for example, didn't just say that, but it was. The £4,300 number was perhaps a silly number to use, but it was a sort of sensible idea of the sort of amount we might be worse off in the future. And now the problem with the debate is that it didn't explain why that was a sensible kind of number. What is the argumentation you have to go through? What are the sets of things you need to believe? What is it about the economy, how the economy works, that resiling from a free trade area will have that kind of big effect on people's well-being. And in the end, I suppose, to some extent, what the debate was about as we came up to the referendum was actually at the core of economics. It was about a trade-off. It was about lots of things, but let's say it was a trade-off between economic growth and income on the one hand and immigration on the other. Now, I'm not saying it was entirely that. It was clearly lots of other things. Well, actually, underlying that are a series of assumptions and falsehoods, in the sense that we know that immigration is not an alternative to economic well-being across the country. It is good for economic well-being. Now, it has distributional effects to some extent, and a lot of the discussion actually here is about distribution as well as about averages and totals. Now, we at the IFS talk a lot about distribution, and economics ought to be fundamentally about distribution, but it's often presented as about just totals and numbers across the population. And when the population is being presented with things about we're all getting the income is going up, there is growth, and if you're not feeling that yourself because the distribution is skewed in a particular way, that's not going to help. It's all very well to say that immigration is good for the economy, but if you're, if there are cuts to local services where you live and you also see increases in demand, you're going to observe that in different ways, and that needs to be fed back. But this issue about trade-offs, I think, is actually absolutely at the heart of economics and economic debate. So there's a dirty secret in Whitehall, in the Treasury, which is they absolutely know how to get more economic growth than we have had, okay? And they decide not to. And they decide not to because they implicitly make a trade-off that they don't really want to have a discussion with the public about. So how would you get more economic growth if you wanted to? And I'm not saying you should do this, because there is a trade-off, okay? You would build an awful lot more houses, and that might well be public house building, and you would build it in London and the South East. And that would be good for growth, absolutely, for sure. But it would take up land, and it would create environmental issues. you would build more roads. For sure, you would build more roads. We know for sure that that would be good for growth. But again, there is a trade-off. You would stick a third runway at Heathrow. Again, there is a trade-off. You would probably liberalise a bunch of competition and labour laws. But again, there is a trade-off. And that is the sort of trade-off that you need to have. I mean, if you're there are other things that matter where actually we don't know quite what to do. We know that education is incredibly important, but actually the truth is no one's ever quite worked out exactly in the UK what it is that you need to do to make it better. Or at least there are a lot of competing views. So what seems to me is that the key of this discussion with citizens, in a way, is about those trade-offs. What is the trade-off between building more and the increased income that might provide and the reduced environmental amenity that it might create? What is the trade-off between keeping promises to pensioners in terms of their occupational pensions and state pensions and so on, and the fact that that absolutely means that people below pension age have less income? What is the trade-off between policies on housing, which mean that owner-occupiers who have a right to expect their housing value to not be taxed or whatever, how do you trade that off against the rights or the needs of younger people? Now, all of those are trade-offs, all of those are at the core of economics, all of those are political decisions as much as they are economic decisions, but all of them need to be taken, all of those decisions need to be taken, I think, with the informed input of people, rather than actually, as I've said, a lot of them seriously are just not considered because they're or not allowed out of the doors of Whitehall or politics because they're considered too difficult or too scary or too politically worrying to put out there in the rather stark way that I have just done. And that seems to me to be what ought to be at the core of a discussion which goes much wider than it goes at the moment.
Cool, thank you very much. I enjoyed your point about trade-offs. I was noticing in the room as you said, the trade-offs for growth, and you said, so more housing. I was going, this is good. And then you said, more roads. Oh, I'm not sure about that. And then you said another runway. Oh, no, I'm not sure about that. And then liberalisation. So it's very interesting that when you get into this trade-offs, it challenges people in all sorts of different ways. So you've all been very patient, and for the next kind of 25 minutes till we finish, we're going to ask you to do quite a lot of work. I'm going to bring the panel in at the end and ask them what they think of your choices when you've made them, because there's going to be two more polls. The first poll is pretty straightforward. It's about your level of expertise. I'm reminded when we asked this question that actually 73% of people think they're above average drivers. So I don't know how accurate this is going to be. But you're going to be asked in a moment, you're going to be asked to choose between 5 things on your little pads. Please give the answer that most closely reflects your confidence level. So 1, I'm an expert. On economics this is. 2, I'm very confident. 3, a little confident, but I could be more informed. 4, I'm not sure, it depends on the issue. And 5 is going to Homer Simpson option. I don't feel confident at all. So feel free to be entirely honest. It will be anonymous. We're not going to pick on people who say 1 and ask them a very hard question. So have a go for it. I think we're going to know the answer almost instantaneously. Is that right? Oh, we're getting the numbers. Oh, that number on the left hand. Oh, so 117 of you voted. 120, 121 voted. Right. Is there a point at which we stop? There we go. Oh, there we are. So, right, you're kind of average distribution. That's kind of standard distribution, isn't it, Paul? Isn't that what? It's a very normal distribution. Yeah, thank you. Good, I've got that. We can't do gender breakdown, actually. No, sorry. No, but we'll do that at a future event. But it's a very good point. Okay, so that's where you are. Most of you are a little confident, but I could be better. I'm not sure, it depends on the issue. Not many of you, it has to be said, basically less than a third feel either expert or very confident, which is interesting when we're talking about issues that really do shape our lives. Now, there's going to be a little tiny bit now of deliberation. I don't like this kind of thing, by the way, what I'm going to ask you to do now, so I'm quite glad you're doing it, not me. We're asking people on the Citizens Economic Council to deliberate for 2 years. We're asking you to do it for 2 minutes. But we are going to ask you to speak to the person sitting next to you when you do it. So we're going to give you a set of options about what matters most to you. So this was the point we were just discussing. Julie was raising, what are the goals of policy? We're going to give you 7 options. And we want you just to talk to the person next to you just for a couple of minutes as you consider these options. We're going to ask you to put these 7 things in order, where 1 is the most important down to 7 that's the least important. So just as you're thinking about it, here are the 7 options. So before you vote, I will tell you when you can vote, but I want you to just talk to the person sitting next to you about what your general view is for a couple of minutes, starting now. Okay, right. Thank you very much. So, as I understand it, you need to vote. You vote. You vote in order, starting with the one that you think is the most important, and then right the way down. So, rank in order from most important to least. So, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be ranking your choices, so you put the numbers in the order that you want to put them. So you might do 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, or whatever. So just do them as a whole list. Do them as a whole list, and then press send. Is that clear to everybody? Very good. All right, so you've got a minute to do that. Oh, apparently if you've made a mistake, you can do it again. But not about last Thursday.
It only records the last answer.
It will only record the last answer you give, so you can't vote twice, but you can change your mind. Is there a number at which point it's going to... a number of people that we're going to stop at?
I think if you just, so maybe about 30. I think you can say you've got 30 seconds left to make it.
Okay. We'll give it 30 more seconds. Let's see if we can get to 120. 8. No, 109. Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. I think we'll see the results in a moment. Here we are. So if you vote 1, you get 7. The option you voted 1 gets 7 points, and then it goes all the way down. So there we go. You don't really care about internet access. You've all got it anyway. Interestingly, you don't really care about growth. So basically, none of you agree with the government's economic strategy, because that's entirely based on growth. Safety and security is quite important to you. A cleaner, greener environments are pretty important to you. Having enough money to live on, the basic, now, interesting, the relationship between that and growth, of course, be interesting. Better homes, schools and hospitals, there you are. Public fabric matters a lot to you. And in the end, a more equal society and less poverty is the thing that matters most to you. So that's very interesting. Now, just before we bring the panel, anyone want to say there was something missing that ought to have been on that list? Feel free to put your hand up, or to say the entire process is ridiculous, or anything you want to say at this point. Does anybody want to say anything at this point? Yes, there's a hand there. Wait for the microphone to come to you. I'm going to bring the panel in at the end to tell us how they would have answered it and what they think of your answers.
A cohesive and tolerant society, I think that's quite important.
Cohesive and tolerant. Is that an economic idea, though?
It might have economic impacts.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, what else? Who else? Oh, yes, there's two hands here. Very good.
Happiness, whether that's economic, but you can be poor and unsafe, but very happy.
Who would have liked happiness to be on the list? Yeah, quite a lot of people. Very good. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Of course, you have to define it first, but behind you, let's take a few more quick-fire points.
I would prefer economic development rather than economic growth. Growth might be like cancer, obesity, steroids, which is much of the current economy.
So, sustainable economic growth, economic development, very good. Two quick points here. I like these really quick points. You first, then hand it back.
A sustainable society to hand over to our grandchildren.
Very good. You don't care about the children, just the grandchildren. Remember what Freud was once asked, why do grandchildren and grandparents get on so well? And he said, because they share a common enemy. Right, okay.
The culture of business and finance to reflect that list as opposed to just the 6-point on the list.
The culture of business and finance. Very good, very interesting. Yes, very good. Yeah, that. Wait for the mic, wait for the mic.
I want to say library because of what you said, because if you're saying that people need to be informed, that's your starting point, and good education. How do you define good education? But.
Okay, education. Last, and then here, and then there, and then we'll bring the panel in. Yep.
I'm the only one who's been being critical of the question. I think they're mostly all interdependent. You have to have growth to do everything. You have to have economic prosperity to do everything. You can't do anything if you don't have someone thinking about the greater good, what's in the best interest of everybody, taking into account all the conflicting interests, but it's impossible just to list them in order of priorities.
I think you're quite right. But it is just an exercise, though. It's a bit of fun. This isn't what we're going to be doing for 2 years. We're not just going to be looking at that for 2 years. No, it's a very fair point. It shows why we need a 2-year process. And then there, yes, back of them. And there was somebody there as well. Yes. Keep your hand up. Yeah.
And they're all predicated on the idea that you have to have money, and that money is the recognised means of exchange, and that there's no other way of organising the economy, and that there's no other way of organising what we need to live. So it's all about buying and selling, right, rather than a different way of distributing.
Is that an argument for barter or Bitcoin?
Either or neither.
Very good. Here.
Gender equality, because that has enormous implications for economic growth.
Gender equality. Is that more equal society? Is that you're assuming that's a class point rather than a gender point?
Okay. He's made explicit.
And I think there was just one last one, wasn't I? See? No. Okay, that was brilliant. Thank you very much for kind of undermining the entire process. Now, panel, what do you think? What would you have said? I mean, obviously, we totally take this point that it's a kind of false question, but it's all these things are involved with each other. But I'm interested, if you've been forced to choose, what would you have chosen, and how do you reflect on what it says up there? Paul, we'll go in reverse order. Paul, what do you think?
Well, the lady at the front really did take my thunder, because I mean, as an economist, all of this depends on growth. You can't have cleaner, greener environment, you can't have money to live on, you can't have more schools and hospitals without economic growth. And throughout, when you see economic growth, you tend to see those things getting better. The thing that I would add something on is the more equal society and less poverty. I mean, clearly, certainly over the 1980s, across the population, and since then, particularly the top 1%, we've had growth, but increasing inequality. And I think we might actually, post-Brexit, let's think about where we're going to go on this. I think we might end up with a more equal society if all the bankers sod off to Paris and Frankfurt. But if they do, then we're going to have less schools, homes, hospitals and so on, because they pay all the tax. They pay, top 1% pays a quarter of the income tax. So if the top 1% had a lot less money, we'd have a more equal society, but we wouldn't have any of this other stuff.
I live in Clapham. Half the population of Clapham is French tax exiles. So a combination of this vote and Sarkozy winning, there'll be nobody in Clapham at all. Okay. Julie.
Well, I live in Clapham, so I'll start.
Oh, that's good. Well, we can hang out together.
Well, I'm pretty delighted by this, really. I think that really shows that the assumption that it's all about growth isn't really shared. Well, not by you people. So, and I think, I find that really heartening. I think I would have posed it slightly differently. I think the cleaner, greener environment, I think if you had people in the deliberative process who really knew about environmental issues, it might be more realistic now to say, are we going to avert disastrous climate change and ecological collapse? Because I think that's the truth, and I think that actually that isn't really discussed enough, and that's part of the quality of our debate. I think it's a trade-off, and I actually think that the woman down at the bottom row who said for the common good, or something along those lines, is actually so important. And actually, if you look at constitutions and the beginning of the preamble of the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, it talks about the commonwealth, the common good, and I think we've lost that, and actually we need to find our way back about thinking about what's for the common good.
Thank you very much. Simon. I know you would never get involved with anything as crude as this, but nevertheless.
And I'm about to criticise the crudeness, but hopefully for I would have broadly put it in those terms. And it's not really the crudeness, but it's the crudeness of the conclusions we're drawing from it. So you were saying that most of us, all of us, don't really agree with growth, but actually that number might come from 20% of the audience putting it first. And that is a really important minority of people who, as a result of us drawing the conclusion that growth isn't very important, will lose out more substantially than the rest of the audience, because we're making choices about seeing this list as a set of priorities as opposed to a set of trade-offs. So unless we understand the distribution of what lies behind those numbers, we don't actually understand how the trade-offs affects this audience, therefore society. So if we draw, this is kind of the danger of expertise and spurious numbers. If we draw concrete conclusions from numbers that are quite, and we do this about economics, we do this about science, we're given these facts, but they're not facts, they're sets of assumptions, and we draw conclusions from them. And can I just reflect on the last poll as well? So, and I'm going to fess up, this is a dangerous thing to say, but I'm a Cambridge graduate, so I'm clearly a persona non grata. And I would have put not confident at all in terms of economics, but I tell you what, if you asked me a question, I would have been very confident in my answers, because I've been trained to be like that. And I think that one of the things goes back to one of my other points, experts need to have humility. We must start acknowledging what we don't know. So as you were talking, Paul, I was thinking, actually, maybe we should have an expert's pledge. And the expert's pledge should be, I pledge always to acknowledge when I'm giving my view as opposed to when I'm giving my expertise. And if experts signed up to that pledge and had more humility, I think the public debate would be one element of a better public debate.
Assumes that we know.
It assumes that we know. It does assume that we know.
Last but not least, Seema. This looks like kind of indexed for a manifesto, doesn't it? Page 538, a more equal society and less poverty.
It's absolutely... Yeah, I'll just take that then, shall I? Yeah. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and we went through it. It sort of seemed quite simplistic, and you can rank them, and then you think, well, actually, this connects with that, and if you have this, then you won't get, that will drive that. And then you think, well, when, it says, what matters the most to you? And I'm thinking, well, when you say you, what do you really mean? I mean, is it me in terms of my own personal interest, or is this me with my politician's hat on and what message I want to give about what's important, what I think is important to you? And so, as a politician, I would be wanting to play out, because if you were thinking about this as a manifesto, you would want that what's in your manifesto is probably in the order of what's important to people and in proportion to what's important to people. But what came through for me was that it's quite, I don't think we always make decisions like that, or when we're responding to questions in our own sort of personal interest. Because you might argue, you know, if you want a more equal society, well, would we be prepared to give up a lot of our wealth directly, and would we say it's going to be in kind of economic prosperity is the way that we would define equality? Would we buy into a taxation system that was more redistributive, because people don't tend to vote for that in that way? So what does it then mean for our behaviour when we think about how it links together? And how honest will we be when we take ourselves out of the picture and go into public debate about what a trade-off might be for ourselves, and then what we would seek trade-offs to for win the arguments in an election for trade-offs to be by others. But I just want to come down to, I want to talk about this last point, the internet access for everyone. I'd actually just like to know, how many of you have internet access easily of your own?
I won't say don't. How many of you don't have internet access?
See, I think this is really interesting, because one of the things we miss at our peril in public policy right now is the way that the economy is going to change, the importance of access to technology, for having really good access for education, for the workplace as well, with the way people will be working at home a lot more. I've met businesses that have had contracts turned down because the speed of their broadband in the heart of a city that isn't London isn't good enough. Look at the digital single market, which hopefully we'll find some way of still being connected with in the European Union, which is going to be fundamental for how technology is going to play out and where the business and economic opportunities are going to come from in the future. But then even the basics of interacting with public services, having access to information for your own health, paying your taxes. I mean, all of these things, and the way we're looking at efficiency for public service delivery, is relying on this last point. And so the idea that that isn't important when you want to achieve number one is also an interesting result from this. And I think as you're developing your Citizens Council, it will be very interesting to see how that might shift with different demographics and around the country, and whether people then interpret these questions for themselves, or they interpret these questions in a very values-driven way.
Great, thank you for that, Seema. The Citizens Economic Council will be selected to be as diverse as it possibly can be. So although it will be qualitative rather than quantitative in terms of numbers, we'll get a sense of people's different perspectives. Look, what we wanted to achieve today was to demonstrate that this conversation is a fascinating conversation that people want to get involved in. We only wanted to scratch the very surface of what is going to be a two-year debate. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to share one fact with you which might emphasise the importance of this, although it's an old fact, but it's one of my favourites, which is in 1992, the Liberal Democrats stood on the manifesto page, remember this, Paul, of a penny on income tax, and it was very, very popular, and people said, this showed people are willing to pay more income tax. It was only afterwards that they did focus groups, and they found that about 25% of the population thought that it was literally a penny on income tax, and so they were in the focus groups taking 10 pence out and saying, can I just pay for the next 10 years? So that's just an example of why it is we need to have this discussion. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. But can I just ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel? Thank you. And before you go, I've just been reminded by our head of fundraising that she was, I'm sorry, yes, I should say thank you to Friends Provident Foundation, the Barrow Cadbury Trust, and other people who helped us make this possible. So thanks again for coming. Bye.